Everyone, and thank you for joining us as we continue to, number one, wrap up this very long look we've taken now over the past year at the office of President of the United States, at American presidential elections, and more recently, in the aftermath of the election on November the 3rd, all of the previously little known and for the most part, previously ceremonial events that take place to certify and finalize the election of an American president. So we are now segueing away from the election itself, and for the next several lectures, we'll focus entirely on the first 100 days of the current, Biden administration. But before we do, we need to sort of pick up where we left off in our earlier lecture. That was 2 days after January the 8th, the really shocking events that took place on January the 6th. Again, just to recall, that is the federally established date, January the 6th, for Congress to meet in a joint session to essentially count the electoral votes that had previously been certified by each individual state as accurately reflecting the results of the vote that took place in early November. Objections historically have been made from time to time about one state or another, and usually they were very quickly dispatched. This year, however, was different. We know, of course, that President Trump and those who were advising him and acting on his behalf worked very tenaciously to find ways to nullify the vote, the certified electoral vote, in a number of states. We know, of course, that notwithstanding what we now, even in the last couple of weeks, have found out to be tremendous pressure placed on various state officials, particularly in Georgia, but in Pennsylvania and Arizona as well. Despite tremendous pressure placed on the United States Justice Department, pressure so significant that William Barr, arguably someone who history is going to judge as perhaps one of the most partisan attorney generals, promoting the agenda of the president, left office, resigned, rather than continue to use his department, the U.S. Justice Department, and U.S. attorneys all around the country to promote theories that investigations showed were not supported by facts. Where's the proof? Show me the beef. So he left, and we know that the president and again his advisors tried to persuade his successor as acting attorney general and even their assistants to try to find some way to begin the process of nullifying electoral votes in Georgia and maybe in other states. All of that apparently had gone for naught because as Congress was preparing to meet on January the 6th, there was overwhelming evidence that in both the House and the Senate, large majorities of members were going to indeed vote to do what houses of Congress had always done when their time came in this configuration, and that was to certify the electoral vote and declare Joe Biden President-elect of the United States by an electoral vote margin of 306 to 232. Instead, we know that for weeks there had been various gatherings in Washington, D.C. scheduled for January the 6th. Some of them, of course, were promoted by the president himself and those very close to him, including his adult children, urging people to come to the Capitol on January the 6th, quote unquote, it's going to be wild. In addition, we now believe that a number of extremist groups, white supremacist groups, groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers were also plotting and conspiring to take certain actions on that day, ostensibly called into service by the president and his words. We know that this debunked conspiracy theory, QAnon, would have a significant presence at the Capitol on January the 6th as well. And of course, if you were watching on cable TV, the speeches went on and on and on in the ellipse adjacent to the White House. The president, of course, telling the gathered crowd that if you want to save democracy, you can't do it peacefully. Let's march to the Capitol. And implicitly, at least, put pressure on Congress to not confirm the electoral vote count. And of course, we saw what happened. The president went back to the White House, and this mob not only marched to the Capitol, but invaded it, occupied it, desecrated these places that have been hallmarks and symbols of not just American democracy, but to much of the world. I don't believe there is a more iconic symbol of how the United States ushered into the 19th and 20th century Western-style liberal democracy. And if you needed a symbol to show how America was governed, the Capitol building probably was a good place to start. But nonetheless, this occupation ensued. Eventually, of course, the National Guard would be brought in, as well as police forces from Virginia and Maryland, to break up this mob, to reassert control over the Capitol building. And then, of course, very early, actually, on the morning of January the 7th, the following day, after 7 senators attempted to object to the electoral vote count coming from various states, all Republican, and in the House, about 140 Republican House members tried to do the same, nullify the certified electoral vote count coming from various states. Congress, in the final act, did in fact certify the election, and it was, of course, Vice President Mike Pence, who, as President of the Senate, presides over these joint sessions, who announced, of course, that Joe Biden was duly elected President of the United States. Now, what we didn't know when we talked about these facts is that we would then see 1 week later, on Wednesday, January the 13th, and then on the following Wednesday, January the 20th, important events take place as a result of and related to what had occurred on January the 6th. I could already see screenwriters and authors 3 Wednesdays in January, the 6th, the 13th, and the 20th, writing treatments about these events, because it was 1 week later, on January the 13th, that the constitutional provision for removing a president from office and permanently barring him from holding federal office again was initiated by the United States House of Representatives. The framers of the Constitution, to their credit, thought of everything in many respects in dealing with how to remove federal office holders who had somehow violated their oath of office or who had committed, in the case of the president, high crimes or misdemeanors in office. And very much in the spirit of checks and balances, given that the president is the leader of the executive branch and all of the departments and agencies that lie within it, the checks for removing a president would lie in a co-equal branch, Congress. And as we know, Congress has, of course, two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Constitution gave a separate, distinct role to each of these two houses as part of this removal process. We recall, of course, that back in 1868, our 17th president, Andrew Johnson, was the first to be the subject of impeachment proceedings. We remember all the way back to 1998 when Bill Clinton was himself impeached by the House and went through the subsequent trial of those charges in the United States Senate. And we know that twice in the 4 years of his presidency, back on December the 17th, December the 18th of 2019, and then again on January the 13th of 2021, President Trump was impeached by the House of Representatives. Now, remember, to be impeached, again, means, for purposes of the Constitution, to be formally charged, to be accused, analogous to an indictment, alleging the acts that the president has committed, which, if proven, would result in his removal from office. This time around, in the most bipartisan vote in the House, in the 4 times that presidents have been subject to impeachment, all 222 Democrats, joined by 10 Republicans, most notably the number 3 ranking Republican in the House of Representatives, the Congresswoman from Wyoming, Liz Cheney. President Trump was accused of inciting an insurrection, an offense which, if proven, would result in his removal from office, and if followed up by a second vote, a permanent disbarment from ever holding federal office again. So President Trump, of course, throughout his presidency, has, again, by his own admission, has been a very mold-breaking, uncharacteristically unconventional president. And going out of office, of course, we've seen events that bear that out. In this case, of course, we know that on January the 20th, at noon, President Trump's term came to an end as Joe Biden was administered the oath of President of the United States. But nonetheless, he was still facing this article of impeachment from the House. And the question is one of, number one, can a president who has left office still be tried and perhaps disbarred from seeking further office? We don't know. because again, we are in fresh, new constitutional territory. There was a case in 1869 where the then Secretary of War in the administration of President Ulysses S. Grant, a man named Belcamp, facing impeachment by the House, resigned, but nonetheless was still tried in the Senate, convicted, and as a result disbarred from holding future federal elective office. So we now know that the trial on these articles of impeachment from the House is going to begin on February the 8th. The House will soon transmit, in the words of the Constitution, these articles to the Senate, and the leaders of both parties in the Senate have agreed to commence the trial regarding these charges on February the 8th. The president has retained counsel. Counsel is now collecting evidence, and the House, just like they did about a year ago, will carry the burden of sending over to the Senate managers, prosecutors, who will have the job of proving their case to the 100-person Senate, who, just like last year, will take an oath like any normal juror would, hear the facts, hear the summations, and then vote on whether or not to convict the president on these charges. The standard needed for conviction is a 2/3 vote of the Senate. 67 or more senators will have to vote to convict. Right now, as a result of the Senate elections in Georgia and new senators taking their seats, the Senate is evenly divided 50-50. So presuming or assuming all 50 Democrats in the Senate vote to convict, are there going to be 17 out of 50 Republican senators who might be willing to do so? A lot of talk these days that sphinx of a Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, a man who throws words around like manhole covers. He doesn't say a lot, has whispered that he is entertaining the idea of convicting the president, removing him, and sort of purging him as a bigger player in Republican Party affairs and elections in 2022, 2024, and maybe even beyond. I'll believe it when I see it, but again, 17 Republicans will have to join 50 Democrats in order to convict. Now, assuming that occurs, that the president is convicted on this lone impeachment article, the Senate will then vote to whether or not to disbar him or any individual convicted of impeachment from further holding federal office. And the standard for this second sanction, this second penalty to kick in, is just a simple majority vote necessary for preventing a convicted president from seeking and holding future elective office. So January 13, the vote was taken to put this process into motion. The following week, up until the inauguration, was one where, again, there was still some mystery hanging in the air. After the attack on the Capitol on January the 6th, we would see more and more National Guard units from every state in the country mobilized and sent to Washington to defend the Capitol building and to defend sensitive locations within the nation's capital itself. In his 4 years in office, President Trump has significantly reduced the presence of American troops in those parts of the world where they've been fighting to one extent or another for nearly 20 years, specifically from Afghanistan and Iraq. A few in Syria have been pulled back. So I didn't actually check the numbers, but you certainly have heard comments that there were more federal troops, 25,000 or so National Guardsmen protecting Washington, D.C. There were 4 times as many in Washington, D.C. as there were then in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria combined. Again, but for the Civil War, the greatest amount of military protection that military leaders have reckoned the Capitol needed. As the date of the president's expiration of office was approaching, we had to work a lot harder to discern what was on his mind. Because following the events of January 6th, in the days and weeks that followed, we saw, of course, his Twitter account with 88 million followers permanently suspended. We saw his Facebook account and Instagram account suspended. The platform that so brilliantly Donald Trump had created as a means to communicate with the American people, being able to bypass, television, radio, conventional media, the use of these social media sites was suddenly taken from the president. So you had to check maybe one of his children's websites or Rudy Giuliani's Twitter account to discern what exactly the president might try to do. He announced in this interim period that he was not going to be attending Joe Biden's inauguration. The first time since 1869, when Andrew Johnson, the first president to be impeached by Congress, did not attend the inauguration of his successor, Ulysses S. Grant. President Trump announced he was not going to attend Joe Biden's. The president, in several statements, alluded to the fact that there was going to be a new administration taking office on January the 20th, but he did not come, or that was the closest he would come, perhaps, to uttering the words concede, lost. Those words seemingly were not extricated from the president himself. Presidents leaving office, historically, are known to grant pardons, a power given to the president in Article 2 of the Constitution, and as much as I could think of, in a document, again, that creates the rule of law, that creates a democratic Republican system of government, that has all of these mechanisms for checking and balancing various powers. The pardon power is really a incongruent relic of an earlier time in monarchism, when kings or princes or sultans had the power unilaterally to expunge and free individuals who were in custody. And again, we've seen every president in modern times leaving office utilize his pardon power. Now, technically, the pardon power is divisible into a couple of different things a president can do. For one, as we've seen earlier in the president's term, the president has the power to commute prison sentences so that individuals who have either pled guilty or been convicted of federal crimes who are in prison, having their sentence commuted means that they are now free to leave prison and go home, but they still have the taint of being a convicted felon upon them. By issuing a presidential pardon in addition to commutation, an individual previously convicted of a felony, by presidential fiat, suddenly has that stain removed. So we were watching, of course, to see who the president might pardon. Might he pardon members of his family? And I think the most beguiling question was he going to pardon himself? Again, just like what do you do when a president has been impeached, but his term expired? That is really new constitutional ground, and perhaps only federal courts are going to determine whether or not this impeachment trial that's going to begin on February the 8th is constitutional. But so is the question of whether or not a president can pardon himself. And there was a lot of speculation that the president might, in fact, do that. But it appears, and we'll get to that, it appears part in a minute, that he did not. He issued a number of pardons to individuals largely imprisoned for non-violent offenses, or individuals who had done their time and lived their lives as good citizens, second chances. And he pardoned a number of individuals, a pretty high number of individuals who were very close to his political orbit and very much part of what I suspect are going to be various investigations by various civil and criminal prosecuting authorities at the federal and state level. The president issued pardons to individuals like retired Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, the president's political advisor, Paul Manafort, who at a time was running the president's campaign in 2016, subsequently convicted and sent to prison, and to Steve Bannon, an individual who played a very important role in helping to drive the president's campaign to victory in 2016. Last year, Bannon was indicted along with two other men for creating a charity soliciting private funds to assist in the building of a border wall between the United States and Mexico, and then allegedly embezzling funds so donated for their own use. The president ultimately decided to pardon Steve Bannon as well. But it does not appear that the president has pardoned his children, nor himself, nor individuals like Rudy Giuliani, unless these pardons were in fact executed and properly finalized, but not publicly announced. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires a pardon of an individual to be published to the public's attention. So we'll see in the ensuing months, I suspect, if these did in fact occur. But the nature of the pardons would have had to have been, so-called preemptive pardons. He hasn't been charged yet. There hasn't been any formal bringing of criminal charges, but in the event they are, this pardon can preemptively prevent them from occurring. That's the type of pardon that Gerald Ford issued regarding President Richard Nixon after he resigned in August of 1974. And with the announcement of that pardon, coupled with Nixon's resignation, the House of Representatives, which was on the verge of impeaching President Nixon, basically adjudged that to have been a moot issue, and the impeachment inquiry came to an end. Now, on January the 20th, we saw again a presidential inauguration, the likes of which we've never seen and hopefully will never see again. In the midst of a very virulent period during the now nearly 1 year long COVID-19 challenge, the live attendance at the inauguration was very limited. And the image of these government officials and Biden family members all seated, distanced away from each other on the stage that had been built on the western front of the Capitol building, the place where 2 weeks before these invaders of the Capitol had occupied. And of course, that iconic photograph of Bernie Sanders with his heavy parka-like coat and big oven mitten looking like mittens, again, was not what you'd expect to see in a normal presidential inauguration. When the cameras did shift from the scene, the presence of National Guardsmen all around the Capitol building was again a reminder of what had happened just 2 weeks before. Now, prior to the inauguration, of course, on the morning of January 20th, if you were up and watching television, you saw President Trump leave Washington prior to his successor being inaugurated, again, breaking with many, many decades of tradition. The president and first lady and ultimately members of his family left the White House, went to Andrews Air Force Base, where a farewell ceremony took place, a 21-gun salute, walking up the red carpet into Air Force One. And because the hour had not yet struck noon, the president flew to his home in Florida. He is now a Florida resident, as we all know, a resident of Palm Beach County, in Air Force One, as he was still President of the United States. About an hour after his flight landed at Palm Beach International Airport, Joe Biden was administered the oath of office, and somewhere during the course of his inaugural address, when the clock struck noon, he then constitutionally became the President of the United States. He delivered an inaugural address that I timed at about 20 minutes. It focused on the COVID epidemic, efforts that his administration was going to take to test more and to, in a more federalized, organized way, distribute vaccinations to people all around the country. And then addressed, of course, the fallout, the collateral damage of this life-altering, routine-offering epidemic. And that was the effects of COVID on the employability and employment levels in the United States, and of course the economic havoc that COVID had wrought. 3 former presidents were also attending this inauguration. Jimmy Carter, 96 years old, away in his home in Plains, Georgia, could not attend. but Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama and their spouses were in attendance. There was a parade of sorts, not like the ones we've seen in the past, where crowds gathered along Pennsylvania Avenue to wave and see the President of the United States. And then the three former presidents and President Biden traveled to Arlington Cemetery to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Later, the Bidens would take possession of the executive mansion, their residence for probably the next 4 years, the White House. Following the departure of the Trumps and during all of the ceremony taking place in the late morning and afternoon of Inauguration Day, the White House staff goes to work removing any evidence that a former president had once lived there and moving in all of the stuff of the incoming president and his family. Sort of awkwardly, as the Bidens were formally entering the White House for the first time, it appears that the doors were locked, maybe an omen, or were stuck, but eventually they were open and they took residence there. Through the late afternoon, we would see President Biden begin what has become an all too familiar routine among American presidents, and that is signing executive orders, which unilaterally give presidents the ability to alter or direct the way cabinet positions, cabinet departments, and executive agencies now under his control interpret and enforce laws. And in this case specifically, we know the executive order is a very easy way to cancel or rescind executive orders that had been previously signed by your predecessor in office. Inauguration evening, we saw again not the inauguration balls and galas of the past, but this virtual gala where from all around the countries, bands played, good words were uttered. Bruce Springsteen, Demi Lovato, John Legend, entertainers came forward to sing again in this virtual fashion. And then, of course, all Americans love a good fireworks display. And as Katy Perry was singing the song, I think it's called Firework, we saw again a tremendous fireworks display taking place in Washington, D.C. The night ended, and then over the next few days, we would see President Biden, among other things, sign 30 executive orders in one way or another, rescinding executive actions that had been taken by President Trump, and in some cases, directing agencies under his control to begin to interpret and enforce laws differently than the predecessor president had. In our next lecture, we'll get much more into detail about how the Biden administration assesses the state of the union, but suffice it to say that some of these executive orders had the effect of, number one, ending the ban on travelers coming from 6 majority Muslim states from coming into the United States. Another executive order halted construction of the border wall that, of course, so famously President Trump had promised to build as he was surging to victory in 2016. Another halted construction of the controversial Keystone XL pipeline. Again, a great battle between environmentalists and energy producers. And the president signed an executive order banning any further drilling for oil in the Arctic wilds, all by the stroke of a pen. And of course, we know a different cross pen for every executive order so signed. What in the world are these executive orders? And how does it, or how are they in their volume, emblematic of how dysfunctional the act of governing at the federal level has become? We've been witness over our lifetimes, and I think in a more accelerated way over the last 25 years, of a breakdown of sorts of the constitutionally intended roles that our Congress, our president, and our federal judiciary were intended to perform. And there's a lot of reasons why these breakdowns have occurred, and we'll get to them in a bit. We again have a very dysfunctional lawmaking process, a haphazard one, a broken one perhaps, and it runs very much at odds as how the framers of the Constitution envisioned a government like ours functioning. We know that the Constitution was written just 8 years, well, 10 years really, into America's revolutionary process against Great Britain. We know that the justification for the beginning of the American Revolution and the writing of the Declaration of Independence was against the arbitrary, unwarranted, tyrannical actions of the British king, who held all power within his own hands. We know that the Declaration asserted that governments should only exist by the consent of those whom are governed, and we know the Declaration asserted that all humans are born with certain inalienable God-given rights that no government can attempt to separate. They're inalienable, to separate from them. So we know that the Constitution would be debated and ultimately written with the Declaration of Independence and its main ideas as a foundation. And we know, of course, that in the minds of the framers, the writings of many of the great thinkers of the age of enlightenment, the period when Europe began to pull out of the Dark Ages, and in many different areas of life and science and medicine and astronomy, in the nature of government, in the nature of the individual, began to apply rationality, logic, reason in trying to discern more understanding of often complicated truths. We know that a Frenchman, a Baron Montesquieu, who lived into the 1750s, had considered the concept of power at a time, of course, when many monarchs asserted to hold absolute power, and suggested that the best way to deal with the arbitrary use of power is to separate it among different sections, branches, might be the word he would have used today, charged with making and enforcing laws. So the Constitution is a document that I think maybe above everything else very much emphasizes this separation. At the first level, and we've talked about this a number of times, the Constitution creates a federal system where certain defined, enumerated, and logically, and that's a big word, logically associated powers are given to the national government. We call it our federal government, while all the other powers are left to the individual states and their own legislatures to deal with. And that, of course, was a great separation. A national capital was going to be eventually located somewhere, but in addition to it, there were going to be, in however many states we actually grew to, state capitals where their legislatures and their governors and their courts would be able to consider a number of issues on their own. And in a time before ease of communication and rapid travel, this geographic separation was just as comforting as the actual enumeration of powers that were given to the national government vis-a-vis that of the states. Now, we know at the national level, of course, a Congress was created, a legislative branch, the president at the top of the executive branch, and then in the most lightly described branch created in the Constitution, in Article 3, a Supreme Court was created, Congress and the president then having the power to create inferior courts, lower federal courts, which they, of course, did. Now, I was struck sometime last year when I read that in the Alabama Senate race, which in November was only one of 5 seats in the Senate out of 35 that were on the ballot, where control of that Senate seat shifted from one party to the other. In Alabama, of course, in an anomaly of a vote, Doug Jones in 2018 had been elected to fill out the term of Jeff Sessions, the former Alabama senator who became President Trump's attorney general for a period of time. The Democrat Doug Jones defeated a judge, Roy Moore, who'd been accused of, among other things, pedophilia sometime earlier in his life. That was a seat that, come 2020, was the one that was most certainly going to revert back to being held by a Republican. And in this case, the former Auburn University football coach turned politician, Tommy Tuberville, did in fact defeat Doug Jones. And I think it was notable that in one of these moments of being interviewed prior to the election, Tuberville was lured to answer what he later said was a gotcha question when asked to name the 3 branches of government. And he said the House, the Senate, and the President, sort of forgetting about that 3rd judicial branch. But in some ways, you know, that ignorance of civics is nonetheless an illuminating observation, because we know that the framers of the Constitution did intend for the House and the Senate to play different roles in being our country's lawmaking branch. From its very beginning, the House of Representatives has been known as the People's House. And however many House districts have existed in that chamber, since 1911, the number has been 435. Matters before the House needed only a simple majority vote to pass. That's one difference. And every 2 years, every seat in the House would be on the ballot. Now, the framers believed that the House was going to be a body whose membership turned over significantly every 2 years. Drafters of the Constitution in letters to individuals they were corresponding with, mentioned how in the world could someone leave a business, a law practice, a farm for more than 2 years to do public service and not go broke. So there was this presumption that members were going to serve, return home, and a new member who'd lived among the people he was going to represent would then make his way to the House of Representatives, probably again to do the same thing 2 years thereafter, return home, and someone else will come. Knowing the issues that were important to his constituents because he'd lived among them during the 2 years prior to him assuming office. We've seen, of course, in modern times, much less turnover in House seats, and more importantly, much less turnover in the party that controls a particular House seat. The reason being, in large part, because of the phenomenon we call gerrymandering, where after every census, sometime this year, following the census of 2020, for instance, state legislatures have to reconstruct their state into congressional districts, the number which is based on, of course, that state's population. Every district has to have roughly the same number of people residing within it. That number these days is about 750,000 per House district. We know that whether a state legislature is controlled by Democrats or by Republicans, they create districts that are going to inordinately enable members of their party to hold more seats than of the other party that didn't have control of the redistricting process. And the result, of course, has been to create a great amount of predictability, not in necessarily which candidate is going to hold a House seat, but instead which party's candidate in the November general election every 2 years is going to win that seat. It's notable that rarely do we see in House elections as much as 10%, 40 House seats, actually change control nationwide from one party or the other. We've also seen, of course, that in most House districts, your greatest fear as an incumbent, and we've got lots and lots and lots of incumbents, lots of them anonymous, lots of them, like my representative here in Florida, often adjudged to be one of the least effective members of the House, that because they come from the party that this district was constructed to hold it, their greatest fear isn't in November, someone from the other party coming and defeating him and knocking him out of office. Their greatest fear is in August or September, someone primarying them, coming from their own party and defeating them as the nominee of the party designed and destined to hold that seat. So both voting the party line in the House of Representatives is very important to members who want to retain their seat. They have to stay in the good graces of their party's membership in their district. And it's worked to prevent the type of debate, compromise, statesmanship that was a hallmark of previous actions of members of Congress, both in the House but in the Senate as well. We know that right now as we speak, those 10 Republican House members who voted to impeach President Trump have big bullseyes painted on their backs. They are all going to face next August. The next congressional elections, of course, are a mere 22 months away in November of 2022. They are going to draw primary challengers that are going to be well funded. And I suspect if the president is able to do this, are going to be supported and backed by President Trump and his family and his supporters. Most notably, Liz Cheney, in a resolution of the Wyoming Republican Party, was accused of being out of step with her party. She can expect a primary challenge. As can congressmen from Michigan, Illinois, South Carolina, and New York, and other states who voted to impeach. Once upon a time, in the not-so-distant past, we know that party members were very much dependent on their party's leadership in order to get plum committee assignments and around election time. Once upon a time, as late as the 1990s and the early 2000s, party leadership could be counted on to draw attention and publicly endorse members of their party in tight races. Now we know in some cases that members don't want party leaders to come in some cases and support them. We know that they were dependent often on party leadership to raise funds in order to run successful campaigns. Now we know, of course, that following the Citizens United case, that members are able to form their own political action committees. They're able to fundraise day after day after day and are not dependent on leadership to open up a pipeline of funding. And we know that one of the great inducements that party leaders had to keep their members in line were earmarks, the ability to insert in a bill specific budget items in order to pave a road or fill potholes or build a badly needed bridge in one member or another's district. We know now that leadership is secondary to the temperature of the constituency of party members in any district. The phenomenon of two moderate Republicans being defeated in a primary by a more conservative Tea Party type Republican is a real phenomenon that we see in the Republican side of politics, and we've seen more recently with the emergence of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Congresswoman Presley in Massachusetts, these further left of center Democrats coming along and knocking off in primaries Democrats that have been accused of being too moderate, not liberal enough. And that's come to drive not just the electoral logic in the House, but often to drive the actions that House members take. Now, the Senate, of course, was an entirely different creature, particularly as it was initially created in the Constitution. And then we'll step over to Article 2 for a minute and recognize, of course, that the Constitution created the office of president, empowered it, created special requirements for any individual who would hold office as president, and created a special process to remove a president who has committed, again, high crimes or misdemeanors or committed treasonous acts. Once upon a time, the federal government as a whole was not as intimately involved in the everyday affairs of Americans when the United States was a more rural farming country. 1860, 95% of all Americans lived in farms or in the countryside. And it was only after America's great industrial revolution in the latter 3.5 decades of the 1800s that we would see the United States become a great industrial power. We would see the concentration of America's population in huge urban areas where factories and mills and oil refineries were located. And we would see our country's population grow dramatically, in part because of the attraction of these industrial jobs to immigrants living in poor parts of, in this case, southern and eastern Europe. So once upon a time, state legislatures were able to handle the bulk of matters concerning the making of laws and enforcing them taking place within their own states. Commerce and business was local. Railroads had not interconnected, every significant population center in the country. And it's fair to say that the action of the federal government was much more focused on foreign affairs, on defending our country, on maintaining a common currency and a postal system, while individual states had enormous amounts of power unto themselves. We know that the number of cabinet offices were but a few for at least the first half, if not more, of our country's history. A Secretary of Treasury, a Secretary of State, later an Attorney General, a Secretary of War in the event that happened, a Postmaster General. But that was about it. However, as a result of America's great industrializing and urbanizing and population growth, it soon became evident by the late 1800s that individual states did not have the power constitutionally to control the flow of commerce that was now not within one state, not even between adjoining states, but in some cases was commerce conducted from coast to coast. And then, of course, as America became a great exporter all around the world. So it would be into this reality that, beginning with Theodore Roosevelt's ascension to the presidency in September 1901, he would push Congress, becoming a very proactive president, succeeding a number of more passive presidents, to begin to utilize a power Congress had been given in the Constitution the power to regulate interstate commerce and to do all things necessary and proper to assist them in this act to take control of national legislation because individual states in so many areas could not do so. And we would see, beginning in 1887, with the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, primarily focused on regulating railroad rates, Congress creating a number of executive agencies. There's now more than 100 of them, given the charge of implementing legislation in the subject matter area that these agencies were created. Some of the first, the Food and Drug Administration, created in 1906, given the power by Congress to ensure that food and drugs entering, again, a nationwide stream of consumption were safe and were what they were billed to be. The Fair Trade Commission, the FTC, enforcing business practices, and again, beginning to encourage the breakup of large monopolies, trusts that were working to the detriment of competition and the average American citizen. We would see, of course, by Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, 30 years later, the list of these federal agencies grow. The Securities and Exchange Commission, make sure the stock market doesn't crash. The National Labor Relations Board, to ensure that collective bargaining rights for workers were abided by. The Social Security Administration, to distribute Social Security payments that were going to be made to American retirees, and so on. These agencies, now about 100 of them, the FCC, communication is their realm. The FAA, Federal Aviation Authority, they deal with, of course, safety in flight, are these congressionally made agencies that have the responsibility on a day-to-day basis to take laws that have come out of Congress and enforce them to ensure that they're being complied with. Many agencies have the power administratively to accuse individuals or entities of violating the requirements of these laws, of conducting hearings to see if those accusations can be proven, and then within that same agency, administering penalties, fines against those found to have actually committed those transgressions. Quasi-legislative power these agencies possess. We've seen, of course, the more traditional number of cabinet departments continue to grow. We've seen, of course, energy and education and homeland security and transportation and labor become some of the later cabinet departments. Both these cabinet departments and these federal agencies are within the executive branch, and thus, theoretically, ultimately, are under the control of the president, the man who sits atop the executive branch. We call the large federal workforce that, in one respect, sees that the government is run day after day after day. We've heard this, of course, referred to as the bureaucracy for a very long time. If we're more sinister-minded, that is the deep state, these career civil service protected employees that hold positions as president after president after president comes and goes. The president is constitutionally required to appoint the individuals who sit atop these cabinet positions and agencies, and a number of lower layers of secretaries, undersecretaries, deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries, who are political appointees that sit atop these departments and agencies. Political appointees come and go, but the workforce, as intended, by the way, by the Civil Service Act of 1881, remains more steady and stable. So as chief executive, as we sometimes call our president, he is at the top of all of these agencies, entrusted with seeing that the laws are faithfully executed. And this again is a presidential power that in the last 120 years has become so large, so manifest. And these agencies and these cabinet departments, who through legislation have been empowered by Congress to enforce laws coming from the legislative process, is, I think, a evolution of our constitutional system that the founders, for all their foresight, could have not envisioned. You know, you can imagine Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer saying, okay, today we're going to travel around the country and investigate safety in airports. And we're going to look at the documents about these Boeing airplanes, and we're going to make a judgment as to whether or not they're safe to fly. Those, again, are powers that have been delegated by Congress to these agencies. How do you check the president in what he does regarding this function, this chief executive function? And for whatever it's worth, how do you check the House of Representatives, the people's house? A great fear that every 2 years, you know, a bunch of inflamed, radicalized partisans were going to come and maybe capture the majority of the House. They came out of a hot, burning issue that might have been prevalent at that election. And how might this House wreck the mechanism of governing America? And the answer to both checking the president and checking the House was the same in the eyes of the framers: the United States Senate. As conceived, the Senate was envisioned as being a more honorific house than the House of Representatives. For one, until the ratification of the 17th Amendment in 1915, the United States senators were not elected by the citizens of the state they represented. They were selected by state legislatures, you know, the smart people, in order to ensure that the interest of the state as an entity was protected. On top of that, senators serve the longest term, 6 years, of any federal office created in the Constitution. And on top of that, Senate terms are staggered, like many senators sometimes might be from time to time, meaning that in every even-numbered year, every election year, only 1/3 of the seats in the Senate are up for election. The Constitution began a process whereby today all 100 Senate seats are located in one of 3 classes, class 1, class 2, class 3. No state could have both of its seats within the same class, so that in an ordinary election cycle, both senators from the same state could be on the ballot at the same time. So, for instance, last year in 2020, the 33 seats that are in class 2 of Senate seats, and these class designations are made when states were admitted into the Union, only the 33 class 3 seats were on the ballot. Georgia's other Senate seat was a special election to fill permanently the seat of a senator who had resigned. In 2022, the 34 class 3 seats that were last up in 2016, they'll be on the ballot. Florida Senator Marco Rubio among them. And then in 2024, the 33 different class 1 seats will be on the ballot. So in any one election, the framers accurately calculated, if the entire House was voted out and a whole new House voted in, the worst thing that could happen was only 1/3 of the seats in the Senate could change, meaning that the Senate would have 2/3 of the members after that election that it had beforehand. And because in order for a bill to become a law, each House has to pass the same identical version of that bill. And then, if there is any discrepancies in the bill dealing with an issue, once upon a time, conference committees, members of the House, members of the Senate met, worked out the differences, reconciled the two bills into one bill that if both houses passed, it would make its way to the president for his consideration. So the Senate was created, and for much of its history, the Senate was the place where a lot of legislation coming out of the House, rash, passionate, ill-advised, went to die a death in the Senate. If nothing else, a death of inattention. If the Senate didn't take up a bill passed in the House, when that 2-year Congress came to an end, that bill was dead. And again, that was by pre-design the framers' belief on how the people and the people's house could be checked. George Washington once supposedly described to Thomas Jefferson why the Senate was created differently than the House and elected differently and had longer terms. They were sitting having tea, and Washington told Jefferson, for the same reason you put your tea into a saucer, he called it, before you drink it. The Senate was going to be the place where the hot tea from the House, the Senate would be the saucer where it would cool, and cool, collected Senate judgment of that bill could be made. Maybe it would pass, maybe it wouldn't. And we know that unlike the House, because the Constitution gives each House the power to make its own rules, to govern their own deliberations, and removal of members and censuring of members, the House has always been majority rule. From the beginning, the Senate has been different. In being a body that once upon a time was known as the world's most deliberative body, the Senate was a place where every member enjoyed the right to unlimited debate. And for a time, one senator alone could stop consideration of a bill pending before it, meaning that if this filibuster was successful, the bill in question would not come to the floor of the Senate for an up or down vote. These days, the filibuster still exists with some recent limitations. Number one, presidential nominees, which the Constitution says must be confirmed by the Senate. And we're talking here cabinet officials, agency officials, ambassadors, and any vacancy in the federal judiciary, which up to 4 years ago, 4 years ago, in the case of the United States Supreme Court, could be filibustered if 41 or more senators elected to not vote to hold a confirmation vote on a nomination. That nomination was dead. The general rule is you need 60 votes out of 100 to have a vote on the matter before the Senate, at which time only a simple majority vote is needed to pass. The hurdle historically has been that 60-vote motion to end debate and take a final vote. 60 senators need to vote to do that. In the case of all of those appointments now, the filibuster is inapplicable. Only a simple majority vote is needed. In most legislation, 60 votes somewhere along the line are needed to eventually pass that bill. There is one exception, and we'll talk about that because we may see it used sometime next month, a process called budget reconciliation, where bills dealing with strictly budgetary matters only require a simple majority vote to pass, meaning that today in a Senate where there are 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats, but where the Vice President, Kamala Harris, is the President of the Senate and the tie-breaking vote in the event of a 50-50 vote, we might begin to see some very narrow 51 to 50 votes come out of the chamber, out of the Senate, provided Schumer is able to get all 50 senators to vote to do so. So the Senate was also constructed to be this check on actions of the president. 2/3 of the Senate must vote for a treaty to be ratified, a good old-fashioned negotiated treaty. Again, Senate had to confirm any presidential nominee, and of course, in order for a bill coming out of the House to eventually be signed into law by the president, the Senate had to pass that same exact bill. We've seen, of course, a breakdown of Congress being able to pass much legislation. Senate seats, like House seats, tend to be rather reliably blue or reliably red. You remember our presidential map. How many states, election after election, are reliably blue or reliably red? We could say the same of about probably 85 to 90 Senate seats. So senators, even though they have long terms, are very much fearful of the primary challenge, or in some cases, the other party coming and taking their seat. Last year, 5 Senate seats changed hands from control of one party to the other. That's a pretty representative number. So legislation that needs to be passed often isn't passed, or when it is passed only with a shutdown looming or a pandemic crying for aid. And any controversial matter, be it health care, be it immigration policy, be it gun regulation, be it religious practice, be it abortion, is too radioactively political for Congress to act. And Congress notably has not acted in any sweeping, comprehensive way in these issues. So what is a president to do? Number one, regarding 2/3 of the Senate having to ratify a treaty, presidents very rarely engage in treaty making anymore. They do things that certainly walk like a treaty, they quack like a treaty, but because presidents call these agreements executive agreements, and Congress has not rebelled against it, we see lots of foreign policy conducted, lots of agreements made without the 2/3 of the Senate voting to ratify, and instead by virtue of this executive agreement. Case in point, President Obama signing on to the Iran nuclear treaty, along with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and Germany. That was an executive agreement. The president permitted the Senate to symbolically vote, but that was going to go through. It was not submitted to Congress for ratification because 2/3 of the Senate would not have done so. And finally, the executive order. Where does that come from? The executive order, number one, does not make law. It cannot create anything that hasn't previously been legislatively created, but via an executive order, a president can direct those cabinet departments and those executive agencies under his control within the executive branch to enforce or not enforce existing law in a manner consistent with what that executive order says. It doesn't repeal or make law. It affects how, during that president's time in office, certain existing laws are going to be interpreted and enforced. So, because no legislation, new legislation has been made, executive orders are easy to do, but they're equally easy to overturn. President Biden, a lot of the 30 that he's signed thus far, very simply redefine and in some cases revoke executive orders that President Trump signed in his 4 years in office. Now, by comparison, Congress passed probably their most important action in the last 4 years was the tax bill that President Trump signed into law. That was an act of Congress. President Biden cannot sign an executive order altering or affecting that law. The only way that law could be dealt with is through Congress voting to repeal or alter it. Good luck watching that happen. So these things tend to, legislation is a lot harder to change than is an executive order. Now, there have been notable executive orders in our history. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, accomplished by an executive order. President Roosevelt's order in turning Japanese American citizens in camps at the beginning of World War II on executive order. In 1948, Harry Truman ordered by an executive order that the military be desegregated. Had, for instance, in the election of 1948, Strom Thurmond, the Dixiecrat candidate for president, been elected, he could have signed upon taking office an executive order resegregating the military. We know, of course, that President Obama in DACA, Deferred Action Against Childhood Arrivals, didn't create new law, and here's where we found some constitutional debate here, but instead he ordered those responsible for enforcing immigration policy to not pursue for detention and removal young people who had been brought to the country by their parents illegally when they were very young, and it deprioritized the apprehension and removal of the parents of these DACA beneficiaries. President Trump came into office and signed an executive order overturning that. And I think it's probably fair to say that our founders did not expect so much of what today constitutes important policy to be done by presidential fiat, somehow directing an agency or department to take some existing law and in some cases bend, distort, and redirect the way in which those laws are enforced every time a new president, particularly a president of another party, comes into office. So we have a legislative process, again, that is mangled, it's dysfunctional, and next month we are going to examine the identified priorities of the Biden administration, see which have any chance of actually making their way into law. That's the best way to do it. Or whether or not President Biden, like President Trump, like President Obama, like George W. Bush, is going to increasingly rely on these executive orders, which, again, short circuit, in many cases, congressional action, presidents often recognizing that Congress cannot or will not act. What do you do? One last thing. Yesterday, January 22nd, marked the 48th anniversary of the passing of Lyndon Johnson, our 36th president. If you like using the internet, Google Johnson's last interview. And it's about a 45-minute interview that Lyndon Johnson gave 10 days before he died. And he mentioned that he had received in 1964 a lot of pressure to guarantee, to do what the Civil Rights Act did by executive order. But in this interview, he said he did not want to do that because in that event, a future president could come along and by executive order rescind Johnson's act. So he was determined for it to come into law by actions of Congress, and because Congress was perhaps more malleable and because he was a master of the legislative process, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was an act of Congress that he signed into law. Don't know what would have happened had that instead been merely an executive order. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you all again very soon. Take care.